This is our first Dais talk on anti-racism, supported by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the first in the series. Today, we're starting with Dais talks on anti-racism, schooling of Ontario's Black youth. For those of you who don't know the Dais, we're a think tank based at Toronto Metropolitan University. Our name means raised platform. And a dais is a place that illuminates the people on it. It reminds us that real change only happens when we lift new voices and ideas. And at the Dais, our mission is to connect people to the ideas and power we need to build a more inclusive, innovative, and prosperous Canada. We work in innovation and technology policy, education and skills policy, democracy and trust policy. We work in policy, leadership development, and civic convening. Special thanks to our friends, the Brampton Venture Zone and Rogers Cybersecurity Catalyst for helping us host this event tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to give the land acknowledgement. This is one thing that we do at the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, part of a wider and hopefully more transformative reconciliation project here at TMU. One activity that we do, but not the summation of it, and activities we continue to try to build in a variety of ways. Those joining us in person at the office of the Dais are located in Toronto, a Mohawk word that describes the place in the water where the trees are standing. TMU's main campus is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. Tonight's session in Brampton is on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and before them, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Wendat people, Huron and Wendat peoples. And we're committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice to Indigenous peoples more generally. We'd also like to pay tribute to those of us who came, who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent who continue to live the impacts of colonization in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And tonight's event will focus more specifically on the experience of Black and Black youth in Canada. We'd also like to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is sponsoring this series. This series, the anti-racism series, both this talk and the 4 talks that will follow, Dais talks in anti-racism, were designed by our staff team. For this session in particular, we were keen to have a timely and crucial conversation of the pressing issue of anti-Black racism in Ontario schools, an issue in which the Dais has a policy interest and a research interest as well. We'll shed light on the challenges faced by Black students and educators while fostering dialogue and actionable strategies to create more equitable and inclusive school environments. I'd now like to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Rahel Appiagyei-David, who works as the Leadership Development Facilitator on our team. Rahel wears many hats as a college professor and consultant and uses her skills and experience as a facilitator to help structure and develop creative problem-solving regimens. And you might hear more about the Leading Through Policy Change micro-credential that Rahel has helped develop and is leading coming in the fall. She works with a variety of institutions to help them learn new skills, plan and execute strategies to achieve the results, and in this case, the results of hopefully a more equitable and inclusive education system. She's been recognized with the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for Community Leadership, recognized by Anne and Ed Mervish, Pinball Clemens in partnership with the CIBC, CBC Radio, City TV's Livable City, and Flair Magazine, and comes to TMU and the Dais with over 20 years of experience in industries such as social services, government, corporate, and academia. And with that, I'd like to throw it now to Rahel, who will say more about the talk and introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Kearie. Thank you, everyone that's joined us here in person and for the folks that are online as well. So today's event is, as Kearie has mentioned, the first session in our series of 5 talks on anti-racism. We're going to be focusing today on anti-Black racism in Ontario schools. We're trying to shed light on some of the challenges that are faced by Black students and educators, but we also want to look at actionable strategies to create more equitable and inclusive school environments. And with that, our very knowledgeable, experienced speakers will be speaking to some of the questions that I have. And what you can expect for today is I'll do the speaker introductions, we'll have a panel discussion, we'll take a break, and then you will have an opportunity during the break to share some questions that you might have. Later on, Jillian, who's supporting us online, will make the Slido login information available to you, so you can pose your questions there. And then we'll do our best to cover as many questions as possible with the time that we have. At the end, both Peter and Kearie will share some solutions, their call to action, some resources for you as well. And for those that are in person, they're willing to stay back a few minutes if you wanted to speak to them as well. So let me jump into our bios, okay? So first, I want to make sure I say your name the way you say it, because I think you say it a little differently than I just said it.
Yep, Kearie.
Kearie's right. Okay, good. So Kearie Daniel is a senior nonprofit leader, community advocate, communication strategist, and thought leader. Kearie has over 20 years of experience leading strategic initiatives across multiple sectors, including healthcare, as lead communications advisor for various initiatives within Cancer Care Ontario. And this is within the Ontario Health portfolio, the nonprofit sector, and the child welfare sector, where Kearie led strategic communications and community engagement for the provincial initiative, One Vision, One Voice community initiative to address the overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system at the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. As a co-founder and inaugural executive director of Parents of Black Children, one of the fastest growing nonprofits in Ontario, Kearie has spearheaded and created the organization's strategic vision, mandate, and approach, and has leveraged her experience with systems navigation in cancer care and childcare system to implement the methodology in support of Black families engaged within the education system. This has changed the landscape of support for Black parents by formalizing the historic practice of Black community advocacy within the education sector. As a learning futurist, Kearie works to challenge existing educational pedagogy and encourages education leaders to reimagine education design. In this capacity, Kearie also conceptualized and led the development of Parents of Black Children's OMO Afrocentric Campus, the first Afrocentric virtual campus in Canada, accessible for Black children and families, offering an alternative reimagining of how electronic platforms can be utilized in the education space. Everyone, please welcome Kearie Daniels. So next we have Peter Amponsah. So Peter is an associate dean and former professor at Sheridan College in the Child and Youth Care program within the Faculty of Applied Health and Community Studies. He has over 15 years of experience volunteering and working in the child and youth service sector, working frontline, management, and governance roles. From November 2008 to September 2011, Peter was involved with the Ontario Youth Matters campaign as one of its co-chairs. This campaign looked to lobby the provincial government to create an outcome-based youth policy framework. The campaign's influence can be found throughout the current Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services Ministry of Ontario, Stepping Up framework and documents. Prior to teaching at Sheridan College, Peter worked as a community engagement worker with Peel Children's Aid Society and supported the work of the Anti-Oppression and Diversity Department. In his spare time, he still has spare time, Peter studies, performs, and facilitates African drumming workshops to various youth groups across the GTA. Please welcome Peter. Okay, so Peter and Kearie, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited about this conversation, and thanks for kicking off our anti-racism topic as well. Before we get started into the questions, I was hoping that you could also introduce yourself the way you'd like to be introduced in the group. So let's start with Kearie, and then we'll go to Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have much more to add. I think I would maybe introduce the organization, Parents of Black Children. So we are an advocacy organization. As you said, I'm a co-founder and executive director of the organization. We were founded in around 2019. We came together as a group of parents, really initially looking to advocate on behalf of our own children and realizing very quickly that our situations, our stories were not unique, and this was a systemic issue. And, you know, as soon as we formed as a group, the floodgates kind of opened. And we were getting calls for support from people, Black families, as far as Thunder Bay, down to Windsor, all across. And now, 2023, Parents of Black Children has a chapter in the US. We're in the talks with someone in the UK to create a space and chapter there. And we've served over almost about 600 families to date with advocacy support. So that's side-by-side advocacy support. And then we also have a mental health program. We support 130 students in our tutoring program, where they get free tutoring twice a week. And some of our kids have been with us for 3 years. So it's quite a feat. And you know, the core of what we do though is advocacy and working towards transformational change for our children. So I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you so much. Up here.
Yeah, thanks for the space and the introduction, Rahel. So I think what I might add to what was shared is the other side of my life is I am currently a PhD student in social work. And my particular research focuses on what I call the conceptualization of care for young people. So I'm really interested in looking at the ways in which care systems construct identities of need, identities of bad, sad, and inherently looking at the power dynamics that are built into these constructions of identity that we all participate in. I think it's also important, just for the context of today's conversation, to note that I'm also of Ghanaian descent. And I offer that to say, I feel that, you know, culture as a protective factor for some of the challenges that we're going to be talking about here today is extremely important. I like to commend Kearie and some of the work that her organization is doing, particularly around this idea of innovating cultural education. You know, the Afrocentric campus is a really, really interesting concept and one that I think has traction for folks. So yeah, I'm here to participate in the conversation as much as I can, and yeah, we'll see where we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. All right, so let's go into my first question. For those who don't know, how prevalent is the issue of anti-Black racism in Ontario schools? And can you share some recent statistics or research that exemplify the severity of the issue? You want to go first, Kearie? I see you smiling.
I can start.
Okay.
You know, anti-Black racism, from where I sit, is a crisis. And when Parents of Black Children first kind of appeared on the scene, that was very much the language that we were using. So we were meeting with MPs and introducing our organization and really positioning this issue as a crisis. When you ask about like research and statistics, you know, it's a crisis from multiple perspectives, right? There's the outcomes of our students. So our children are not faring well in the education system. They're not graduating. They're more likely to be suspended. We know that. So they're not doing well. So it's a crisis from that perspective. And it's a crisis just from the overall, just the system overall. You know, I always position it as our kids are kind of limping across the graduation lines. For those that make it there, they have this, sometimes it's invisible, sometimes it's not, these traumas that they're carrying with them. And so this is a crisis. We're so complacent about our experiences as Black people of African descent within the education system, and those in positions of power there's apathy to our outcomes, where we're not really paying attention to the fact that we are in crisis. So, you know, when you ask what's the problem, it's from top to bottom. Yeah. It's the entire system, it's the entire structure. And you talk about, you know, Parents of Black Children has 10 demands. And they range from everything from, the first thing is, you know, that we as Black people need to be recognized as a unique entity, the same way that we have legislation that, that is specific for Indigenous communities. We need that for our Black communities because our data tells us that our outcomes are actually we're not that far off from outcomes that Indigenous people are experiencing. And there's so many similarities that we should be classified as kind of unique and having unique needs and experiences. And we need that within our education system so that our children can be centered in the education process. So that's that's the first demand. And that leads into the decolonization of our curriculums and all of those pieces. But it is a crisis. And I really want to encourage people to think about it like that. We're so used to Black people, this pain that we have and that we live in trauma, but we cannot allow our children to keep living in that trauma. We have to recognize it for what it is, which is an actionable crisis.
Do you want to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is I think nobody needs to really spend the amount of energy on describing the prevalence of anti-Black racism. I think certainly you can see it at the local level. You can see it in the experiences that individuals have when they describe their everyday lived experience. And so, I think there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of information on that. But I think what's really important to acknowledge is that not necessarily how prevalent the issue is, and this is going to be a theme in the way I sort of describe my points today. But what is this prevalence constructing and creating amongst us? And I think what we don't give enough attention to is the resources that get directed towards the issue of anti-Black racism. That is the indication that we have a very prevalent issue. And so we have to consider some of these resources, including the intellectual and ideological energy that we invest into discussions of anti-Black racism. Who are the bodies that are asked to invest into that intellectual and ideological energy? And so, again, in order for us to maybe think of alternative places to go in our discourse of anti-Black racism, not so much the prevalence is where our focus should be, but what is the prevalence constructing? What is it producing within us? And again, there's resources that are out there. One that I would maybe direct folks to is the Ontario Human Rights Commission. They have an ABR and educational engagement guide that I think is an interesting document. And there's also a lot of grassroots literature that has been produced from community. Certainly, I would also encourage folks to check out the work that is on, Turner Consulting's website. Interesting story here that I'll offer. A number of years ago, I had a chance to co-chair an initiative here in the Peel region called the Faces of Peel initiative. That collaboration had an opportunity to do some research into the experiences of young Black people in the Peel region. We successfully conducted the research. We engaged a number of young people. We produced a report. We presented that report to the Peel District School Board. You would think that a collaboration that has thought through a research initiative and has done its best to engage as many members of the community as possible, you would think there'd be some value and credibility given to that work. Unfortunately, that work was deemed as not, what's the term, based in research. Let's just say not adequate enough to represent the story or the experiences of Black youth in Peel. Shortly after that, we had the We Rise Up report. And the point I'm trying to sort of paint here is we know the issues, right? But there seems to be moments in which we choose to ignore the issues in favor of maybe allowing people to invest their energy in different and probably not the best, most appropriate places. So resources are out there, but let's invest time on focusing on what's being produced, not how things are being produced, not what's being produced.
Can I add to that? So you mentioned the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I want to say this about the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which also speaks into what you're talking about in terms of the reports that have been created. So for over a year, parents of Black children have had an ongoing campaign to ask the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the body responsible for our collective human rights in this province, to launch an inquiry into the experiences of our Black students. You're right, we know what the issues are, but there has never been a holistic investigation from top to bottom. So from kindergarten right to grade 12, all of the issues, that has never happened in this province. We've had regional approaches. So there's been some work out in Peel. We've had Dr. Carl James do some work on Toronto School Board, and he has a little bit of data from York Region, and but it's very sporadic. There's never been, and we have decades and decades and decades of reports and information from different community groups, from different researchers, but we have never had what we deserve as a collective of Black communities, which is a fulsome inquiry into what is happening for our children. There are school board leaders in this province who will sit at a table like this and tell you that there is no racism in their school. We only have 5 Black kids. There's no racism, right? They will tell you that. And they can tell us that because we don't have anything that's kind of fully documented to articulate our experience other than what we know and what we talk about at our dinner tables and in community rooms and community spaces like this. But our Ontario Human Rights Commission has said no, that they're not doing that. They're not going to do an inquiry. When we think about Indigenous communities and our truth and reconciliation, we are where we are with truth and reconciliation because there was an inquiry, there was an inquest. That's where it started, and that's what we need for our communities. I think that part of the reason why there's this push not to do that is because it would lead to mass lawsuits, and there's no denying the experiences. We have kids who are physically harmed in school, teachers grabbing our Black, and they are targeting Black students. There's no question about that. But people don't know. And we hear about these things one-off, right? There's a news report here, and then everyone kind of talks about it a little bit, and then they move on to another, and another one pops up in another area, and then we'll talk about it, we'll get upset, and we'll go hold a rally, and then we'll move on, and then it happens again, right? And so we can't continue to kind of peddle like that. And so we need the documentation.
Okay, thank you both so much. I'm going to go to the next question. Just for a little bit of context, at the Dais, we are a public policy and leadership think tank. And we're always interested in what the government's priorities are, what their laws are, and the ones that need to change to resolve some of the root causes of the issues. I know you both kind of spoke to it a little bit, but what would you say would be public policy changes that would help either address? I know you have the 10 demands, I hear you. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about those. But yeah, what do you think are some public policy changes that would help address the issue of anti-Black racism in Ontario?
Yeah, I'll take a crack. I think certainly Kearie has set the table for some of the resources that are required in order for us to have a full public policy conversation, right? So that's important. The data, particular bodies of knowledge need to invest in collecting that fulsome data. What I would offer to folks that are going to be engaging in the public policy process, so food for thought, though, is the idea that the very individuals who participate in the public policy process are part of producing the discourse on race. They are not separated from it. And so I think sometimes even when we think about the construction of scientific knowledge, we assume that there must be this level of objectivity between ourselves, and I'm suggesting that we actually need to problematize that. And in doing so, we allow conversations about proximity to the material we're writing policy about, the communities we're writing policy about, that's going to matter. It's going to have a different influence on the lens with which we look at communities from. And so I think we need to make sure that's a part of the value that folks who come to public policy are thinking about. The other thing I would add is anti-Black racism as a public policy direction cannot be thought through without considering the other aspects that make up social life, which include things like gender, race, gender, sexuality, class, etc. And I think if that is not declared right up front when we're engaging in creating public policy or the lens which we look at public policy from, we've already gotten to kind of narrative of race that isn't wholesome, because we're taking portions of our identity and enacting processes based on that. And then the last thing I would offer is, historically, I think we have to acknowledge that race as a construct is thought about through what I would call relationally opposition dynamics with other groups and other communities. And so public policy, with all its well-intentioned efforts, must always consider, when public policy is written for communities, what is the relationality to other communities? You know, I think Kearie talks about the efforts and investment that has been given towards our Indigenous community. And certainly there is a history of Canada here. There is also a history of Blacks in Canada here. And I worry that once we start to engage in highlighting the historical plights of communities, it creates this unaccounted for antagonism, because race historically requires those that dynamic to exist. So I would offer those as considerations for folks engaging in the public policy process.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because yes, sometimes there is that competitiveness between communities, like, oh, why is it Black people? What about our community? There's more of us and all of that. So that is definitely an important dynamic. You want to add anything?
I think that I understand what you're saying about what's the phrase, the oppression Olympics, is that the phrase?
Oppression Olympics. Okay.
I understand that. And I think but that's also where we kind of fall down, right? Because we're not collectively as you know, intersecting communities working towards these goals, because what impacts us as Black people and impacts our Indigenous brothers and sisters and other racialized groups as well, and we need to work together. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about one of those pieces. But in terms of the public policy piece, I think you did a great job at kind of setting the stage for us in terms of how we should think about engaging in public policy. And maybe I can speak a little bit very quickly, a little bit more about a little bit more granular. So yes, parents of Black children, we have 10 demands. We try and, you know, every year we're advocating for different things around these 10 demands. I think one was the first year it was around streaming, so eliminate streaming. There was a big push around that. Our community has been fighting for that for decades. I know that. I think our voice, we added our voice to the cry at the right time. And so the government has shifted to a policy that now says that, what do they do? They're de-streaming grade 9. They started with grade 9 math. Teachers, you know, there's all that kinds of backlash around that, but they started with grade 9 math and then moving that forward to kind of go with the goal of de-streaming in general. So we're pushing towards that. The other one was around suspension. So now kids 8 and under are not allowed to be suspended. We know that they still are being suspended. So there's in-school suspensions. They're being sent out to class. There are ways around it. We've heard instead of the use of suspensions, now there is exclusion. So within the Education Act, there is a section that speaks to an arbitrary power that administrators, that principals have to exclude a child from school. And you don't even have the, whereas with a suspension, you have to give them a date. With an exclusion, you actually don't. That child cannot return to the school until you feel they have met. So think about the shifting goalposts there, right? And what that means for our children. So all of those pieces are policy pieces that we, as well as, you know, our community partners are looking at. And we continue to look at. And I would encourage everyone to be part of that discourse. This government recently passed the Better Schools and Outcomes Act. We were heavily invested in providing feedback on that act, but we're one organization, and everyone who cares about equity in education should be looking at those policy pieces, the legislation, and providing feedback and going to feedback and making your voice heard. That's really critical, because that's actually what is going to impact our students in the classroom. And that there's also Bill 16 right now, which was Laura Maylindo had put forward. It was the equity in education bill, I think. And that is kind of just sitting there. So we need a push to get that table so that we can move that forward as well. Because all of those people, that's what's going to protect our kids and what's going to drive change.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you both for those very clear examples, and I hope if there are policymakers online, you're taking notes. Those were really great. Are there any examples of promising policy solutions from either other provinces or territories in Canada, or even countries actually, that you have seen work well, or that you think would work here? Ariel.
Was in New Brunswick, they have like it's like a crisis response team when there's an incident of anti-Black or anti-racism, and when there's an incident of racism. And I think, you know, that kind of response is similar to what we need here. What we're finding is, you know, when we have our advocates who are going into schools with parents, whereas when we first started and the school boards didn't quite know what to make of us, who we were, they probably thought we would be operating very similar to how community groups operated in the past. They were very welcoming. Everyone, we're so happy you're here. We're so excited. This is so great for our parents. But now, a few years down the line, you know, when they hear us and they see our advocates coming, there's this fear, and there is a language of fear that is being spread within that world, within the administrative world. I mean, we got a letter from the Ontario Principals Council, so a provincial body that was directed to myself and our chief advocacy officer. In that letter, this provincial body laid out and used words like that we, Black women, were threats, that we were uncivilized, that we didn't know how to comport ourselves in meetings, that their principals were being berated, that they felt threatened and scared, and they had to like take time off because this is because we have an advocacy team that is going into meetings and holding people accountable for the treatment of our children.
Yeah.
You know, and that pushback is real. And that is a big piece of what we're seeing right now. And so I don't know. I just thought about this and I thought, I don't know of any place where I can say that we can hold it up as this kind of shining light. What I do know is when you have a system that is committed to working and everyone comes to the table with that view, that's what we need. We're in a very critical space right now where people feel empowered to kind of just push back and say, I'm not going to engage with you, right? Or we had an email from the Halton Catholic District School Board where we have a parent group out there, a Black parent group, that has been trying to meet with this board for at least, I'd say 6 to 8 months. So imagine that. These are parents of children. They have their children in the school board. This is a public school board, right? It's Catholic, but it's still public, it's our dollars. And these parents have been requesting a meeting with the school board leaders for 8 months. The meeting was set and then it got canceled. And then the parents said, you know, this is racist. The fact that you're doing this to us is racist. And the response of the director of education, John Klein, was his name. His response was, we have a racism reporting tool. So here's the racism reporting tool, and you're saying it's racist, but you have to fill this out. And so his response was just, it's white supremacy in action. It's let me bog you down in bureaucracy so that we don't have to respond and deal with you, right? And that's what our families are, just to get a meeting to talk about the issues that their kids are facing in that board, you know? Thank you. Sorry, I went off on a tangent.
Yeah, I think I too struggled with identifying examples, you know, best practice. But what I will say is there's certainly examples of practices that are pushing for policy changes, that are responding to policy directions. And I think we need not look any further than here in Peel District School Board with the initiative that some personal connection with, which is the Black graduation coaches. And certainly it is not a perfect project, but we have to give credit to their ability to have a presence within the school system, creating safe spaces for young Black students. And similarly, there's equivalent work happening in the Toronto District School Board. Certainly a colleague of mine, Tinita Monroe, is spending some time building the capacity of young people to be able to engage in the sort of discourses that make public policy folks interested in what they have to say. And I think, you know, as much as we might want to look external for best practices, we also have to recognize there's folks in our very communities that are stepping up to the plate to address these challenges of anti-Black racism.
Okay, love it. What I pulled from your comments are there's people doing it right in different ways. I think my favorite thing is to involve the young people in the process, because oftentimes we don't include them in the policy. So, okay, thank you. So my next question is, what is a common misconception that you think today's policymakers have about anti-Black racism in Ontario schools? And what is the truth?
I'm going to start, and I'm going to tie in something you said, which is about our Black graduation. I think you know what I'm going to say. I know that there are those individuals who occupy those positions across the province are like phenomenal. They're tired, they're phenomenal. They care about the students. They want our kids to be successful. I know all of those things, and they're dedicated. I know that. But the problem with the Black graduation coaches is it's in their name. The problem is that it problematizes our kids, as if our children are the problem, right? It's that we just need to get some people to work with these Black kids so we can get them to graduate, because God knows, like, they're the issue, right? That's the problem. And so when we talk about that's the biggest misconception, that there is something inherently wrong with our children. There's nothing. Our kids are so smart. They're so bright. Someone said to me, we were supporting a family, and she was a teacher. Her name is Sheridan Martin. I'm going to say her name is Sheridan Martin. She runs the organization Anchor out in Vaughan. And she was a teacher for many, many years. And we were supporting a family, and she was with the child, and we're watching this child, and she said, you know, and I always found this really profound. Like, the problem is that our education system does not know how to identify Black giftedness. They don't know what giftedness and excellence looks like in Black children. It looks different, you know, to have a gifted Black child. And when you meet, sometimes when we have families that are coming to us and they've had issue after issue with their child, And we meet these kids, and I'm looking, these kids are brilliant. They're so smart. They're so bright. And the system pushes against them because they challenge the system because they're so smart. And they don't know what to do with them. And they don't know how to identify that they are bright. And so the biggest issue, the biggest misconception is that our children are the problem, and they are not. It is a system problem. The structure, the education system as a whole is an issue. Our kids are just bright, just as ready and willing to learn, just as eager to go to school as any other child out there, and just as able to learn, right? Right? And just as naughty, and just as, like, everything is just as everybody else. But they are problematized. And that's the biggest issue, biggest misconception, that there's something wrong with our kids, and there's not.
I agree, and I have so much I could add to that as a parent myself. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kearie hit on some really good points, but the problematization that is embedded in race, again, I think comes from the historical construction of it, which required a deficit-based discourse in order for race to function within the hierarchy and categorization that allowed for the kind of inequity that we experience in the world. And I think really the only other thing I would add to Kearie's piece is one of the misconceptions is that communities can be understood through policy, and that we require more policy and more the materials that construct a discourse for us to understand. Much of this is attached to the heritage of the competency sort of based models that we have in education spaces. And I worry that we are developing into a society of I will only know something if I've read it, or encountered it within some grand text that tells me that this is what this community is about. Yeah. Certainly, we haven't not hit on it yet, but there's diversity within the experiences of these Black that we talk about. So it's really important that we don't allow public policy or policy alone to inform the ways we come to know and understand, especially if the basis of race has the history of deficit-based thinking.
Okay. Thank you. Those were some really, really good points. We're supposed to give everybody a break at 6:45, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question, just because I think it's important for this discussion. If everybody doesn't mind, you'll get to your patties and your juice just now. Okay. So, does it matter how Black is defined when we're talking about anti-Black racism and public policy? Last question I'll ask, and then we'll have you go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. I think it does matter. It matters to those that are deploying the terms attached to race. And it certainly matters to those that are being captured by the terms, by the racial terms that are being used. And also, I think, I've mentioned earlier the levels of diversity that exist within the category, the social category of Black that we've been referring to. I think we have to allow space for the nuances within that to be pulled out. And so, yeah, it matters. I think when we deploy the term, we have to recognize, I like to refer back to what Paulo de Cueto and Srimanta Mohanty had in a document they did around the well-being of Blacks in the Peel region in defining Black. Some really helpful language. They said Black is a political term used to categorize and identify people of African and Caribbean heritage who have a historical experience of the transatlantic slave trade. I think that gives us some language to start sort of, disrupting and playing around with it with Black a little bit. And again, recognizing that when we deploy it, we're deploying it for a particular political purpose. Colleague of mine would look at me and frown and say, "Oh, so what about the Black Panther movement? And what about all of, was there nothing?" And I think all of that, again, was deployed for a very politically productive purpose. So it does matter.
Thank you.
So I think
Sorry,
this,
quickly, Peter, there's a request online for you to repeat, your previous question's answer.
Previous question?
Yes, in case you remember. I know that there's also recording as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. The response around, we think communities can be understood through policy. Yeah, that's
Oh.
really the response summed up.
Say it one more time, just so they.
Yeah, so my response was suggesting that one of the misconceptions is we feel as if communities can be understood through policy. And so we engage in producing a whole database of knowledge around communities, assuming that that is what gives us deeper insight into their well-being.
Thank you, Peter.
I think in regards to the Black, how we did. So I agree with everything you said, but I also disagree slightly in in that, you know, for me, and we do define Black on our website. So on Parents of Black Children's website, we've been very intentional in defining what Black means, and who's encapsulated when we say Black. And for us, it's everything. Whether you are of Nigerian descent, Ghanaian, or Caribbean, Latin, Afro, Latinx, and or if you have one Black parent. And so we define that because we felt it was important that people understand what we were referencing when we say Black. But I would also say that, so I know that the intersections in terms of our cultural intersections when we use and utilize the term Black, when we think about that. But in terms of the experience in the system, I don't know that it makes, I hesitate, I don't know that there is a vast difference in the experience. If you are sitting in a classroom as a 10-year-old, whether your family is from, you know, West Africa, or whether your heritage is from Jamaica, or what, you know, we could layer onto that what maybe if you are, you know, hijabi wearing and you're Black Muslim, and so we can layer things onto that. But I think that the experience, like for us to really come together and drive change, we have to think about what that experience is, and we have to unite in this collective experience that we have, and speak with one voice to push for change. And sometimes I worry that the thinking of that or not, I think that, you know, unpacking the nuances of us as Black people and where we're from and how I don't know, sometimes it feels that it takes away from that collective push for change.
Okay. All right, thank you both so much. Okay, folks, so it's now 6:52. Can we take a 5-minute break? You can use the washroom, grab some juice, some patty, and we'll come back at 6:57. You also have an opportunity, especially for our folks online, to post some questions in our Slido. And I will pull from your questions now to both of our speakers for the next half of the session. All right, enjoy your break, everyone.
It's called weird.
All right. Thank you all. I extended the break a little bit, got caught up in some side combos and I didn't even get to finish my patty, but it's okay. We're back now and I see that there are some questions that have been posted up. So I want to jump into them so that you folks have enough time to address some of them. So Peter, this first question is for you. I like the notion of exploring other approaches to addressing racism in schools. Can you share some promising practices that you have come across? I know you've shared a few already, but I guess I want more details.
I guess an example that I could share that I have a role in is the sort of Afrocentric education that Afrocentric education curriculum that was rolled out in the Toronto District School Board, particularly when in the Afrocentric school around culturally relevant education. So I am a drummer, traditional West African percussionist by study. And I study, share, and perform across the city. And I was allowed, encouraged, invited to come into the school and provide regular sort of lessons for students. And you know, it's funny because I don't know how to describe the sort of outcome that you see in young people from a week one where a student is allowed to engage with a culturally relevant tool to the growth and development that happens in them in week 8, 10, etc. And I think the point that I'm trying to tease out here is practice that I think is important for us to be engaging in is identifying those culturally relevant and bringing them into proximity with our students. Drumming is an easy one for me because of my own personal experience, but it is something that I've challenged systems with, right? What is that? What are those tools, whether it be curriculum, you know, unique ways of teaching curriculum? You know, I want to reference the work of Professor Dais, who talks about, you know, bringing Afrocentric proverbs into the educational curriculum and how that opens up sort of the intellectual options for young people. So That's what I would offer as a promising practice, having intentionality around identifying conflict and bringing them into the classroom.
Thank you. Kearie, I know the question was aimed at Peter, but if you have anything to add, you're welcome to.
I think the word I would use to describe what you're talking about is just they bloom. Our kids when they are surrounded by that Afrocentrism and they see themselves reflected, and it's kind of reflected back to them in curriculum or in what they're undertaking in learning. They bloom. We see that in our tutoring program with our kids and the feedback that we get from their parents. And I see that with my own kids, right? And just how my daughter attended a Black summer camp one summer, and my sister who lives abroad came back and she's like, what happened to her? But it was just, she just blossomed and her self-confidence just grew. And it's like, that was 3 years ago, and it's still, she still talks about it. And yeah, so it makes a huge difference and a huge impact in their lives for sure. And it shows us what they are lacking. Yeah.
I just want to add to with the Afrocentric school. I remember when it first started, I read an article and it was actually a white girl that went to the school. And I think it was her and her parents that were talking about the impact it had on her. And the parents were like, I know this is an Afrocentric school, but because of the way they teach, because of the way the children are treated, my daughter's still thriving here, even though she's not Black. So there's still a benefit to children, period, I think. And I wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what folks have tried to describe, right? What is an Afrocentric pedagogy? I'm not going to act like I'd be able to describe it, but I think what you're talking about is the pedagogy that exists within that education space.
Yeah.
And its ability to open up, again, intellectual possibilities for all people, but certainly we know it lands in a particular way for
sure. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. So, hold on, I'm going to try to make sense of this one. Okay, so how can we begin to form those steps I listed? So here's number one: allow Black experts to shape the definition of Black children's brilliance. Number two, how it is expressed. And number three, how it should be equitably measured. What does success look like? Does that make sense, or should I read it again? It's a little bit layered.
I think I understand. So I think I understand what the question is asking. And I would say this. So I would never hold the child welfare system up as some kind of beacon, because we know the impact that child welfare, children's aid has had on Black families historically in this province or across the world, really. However, there is a framework which you referenced, the One Vision, One Voice framework, which speaks to how CAFs should engage with Black families. And it's everything from should the leadership of children's aid societies look like, right down to where should Black children, if Black children have to be removed, where should they go? Which is, they should not be in white homes, they should be with a cultural match, and a racial and cultural match, right? Like and everything in between, And what's great about that framework is that it identifies these 11 race equity practices, which means any worker across this province, in theory, should recognize and know, if I have a Black family in front of me, this is how I should be operating, or these are the things I need to consider. This is what I need to think about. So it gives them a framework to work with. And I think that's what that question is asking. And I would say, when we think about education, what we're missing for Black families is the framework. And what's great about that framework is that, to your point, it is created for Black families, but what it is at its core is good practice. And that's what we need for education. We need a framework of just good practice. This is for Black families. But if we follow this, all of our kids are going to benefit because it's just good teaching. It's good practice. It's good education, right? That's what we need. That's the big piece that we're missing. Okay, thank you.
Peter, do you want me to rephrase the question or? you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I have beyond what Kearie shared. What I will say though is, I think in a couple of the examples I already talked about, community work happening from school board with equipping young people. Sorry, I need to speak up. with equipping young people with the capacity to create spaces for their voices to be heard. We have a long history within the work with young Black people of engaging them in that way. As much as it is needed. We also run the risk of at times tokenizing young people because we create these windows of opportunities for their voice to be heard. And that window of opportunity shuts, those voices we assume also shut. And so, yeah, I think what I'm trying to describe here is none of this stuff happens in isolation of multiple considerations, such as what continues to be the relationship of these young Black people that we want to be creating voice for, what continues to be their relationship to the adults who have engaged involvement in their lives, to the communities who care about their well-being. We cannot allow these young people to sit in isolation as if you know, they are the representatives for, you know, all of Ontario's young Black folks. They present a particular picture of what's going on, and we need to be able to allow them to do that.
Okay, thank you. One thing I wanted to pull up from this question, because there's just a lot of layers to it, was the measuring part. Do you folks have some suggestions on how this framework, if we were to come up with this educational framework in Ontario, how would we measure the impact of success?
So I would say that's in the implementation, right? But school boards currently, they should be collecting race-based data. And I believe they had till June 2023 to collect race-based data. The issue is that they don't actually have to do anything with it other than collect it. So when we talk about the measurement, they have the ability to measure outcomes of our Black children. And we need to think about how we implement other areas of measurement. So whether, you know, for us, one of the things we advocate, or one of the things we are advocating for is equity audits of school boards. So just random audits of school boards and to address like how are they doing in terms of inequity in these in particular areas, right? So I think we have to push for those kinds of solutions. And when we talked earlier about the policy pieces, we have to understand what school boards, what the education system is capable of. So what they currently have, like they have the information, it's not a secret, you know, how many children are experiencing anti-Black racism or kids that are being homeschooled, like that's it. They have that data. It's just, it's not being, no one's really pushing them to publicize it and to use it and so we really need to concentrate our efforts in those areas. I think we have a lot of data, we have a lot of ability to measure. We just need to make sure it's being done.
Okay, thank you. Want to add anything?
No, other than I think like we need to be clear about what those ends are, what the outcomes are. I think Kearie's right. It starts with the implementation. I think it starts with the conceptualization, which what we deem these outcomes to be. But I would also say, you know, take a page from Dr. ABC. Black joy should always be a part of those outcomes, right? And so we should, in the same way we're able to imagine the deficit-based, you know, discourses of communities and races, we should also allow ourselves to imagine the idea of Black joy and imagine our young people when they're blooming, when they're overwhelmed with just feeling so good about themselves. We should be able to imagine that stuff as well, allow ourselves to go there.
If the negative part is deficit, then I want to call that part the abundance.
I like that.
Okay.
I like that.
Okay. All right, so let me pull up another question. So Black children and youth are exposed to systemic deficit messages and narratives from an early age. How does this impact their educational outcomes and well-being? Who'd like to take that one?
Yeah. So what I would say is it informs their whole experience because they're in receipt of the discourse, the categories that are placed upon them, deficit-based categories that are placed upon them. And so I think it's an interesting point you bring, because if we're able to acknowledge that in essence there is an inheritance that young Black people take on, that allows us to shift the focus away from it being about the individual deficits of the young person, and the gaze turns back on the systems that require a particular narrative of the young person in order for them to come into contact with each other. So starts with recognition, awareness that that is a discourse, but shifting the gaze away from the individual back onto systems.
Another question that's come up. How can we ensure that anti-racism initiatives in schools are not just token gestures, but are integrated into the curriculum and culture of school?
I think that's a great question. And I think it starts, the issue with anti-racism initiatives currently is, there's a couple of things. So the first is that they're not mandated, and it's up to the school board and the particular administrator and the principal as to whether or not they determine that they're going to hold anti-racism or something or the other on a particular PA date. So we really need these things to come from the ministry. I know that there's some requirements that administrators have to take through the Ontario Principals Council, the Ontario Catholic Principals Council, and through the ministry as well. But none of these are enough, and they don't. Oftentimes, they're not, and they don't hold the weight of accountability. So we're not measuring. We're actually not measuring how they're implementing what they're learning, or if they are implementing what they're learning. They kind of just go off. They take a course, they check the box, and then they move on. And so we need to look for that piece where we have that bit of accountability to do some kind of checks and balances. And that's why we say that part of that maybe we find that in some kind of equity audit. So I would say that's a big piece. The other thing that I want to address, which I think I touched on, is just there is a pushback against equity work and anti-Black racism work. And I don't want to over-inflate the pushback, because there are boards that are committed. We've heard people say that they're committed, but there is a sector of, of people within education who maybe didn't feel comfortable in this world and, talking about race and equity and all those things. And now they feel emboldened to kind of push back and say, we shouldn't be doing this. And I really think that we need to be firm in the resolve to ensure that equity, anti-Black racism in particular is embedded in the learning tools for educators and leaders within school boards.
Okay, so I love that, embedding it. Also, just some accountability by measuring what happens after these. I think this person called it, well, the question's been removed, but it was like the language that they use where it's kind of like fluff. So what do we do with the fluff? How do we make it, what was it? Lip service, yeah, exactly. So how do we move it from lip service to actionable? Did you want to add anything else, Peter, to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kearie's given some really good insight. But I agree. I think making sure that we're keeping our pulse on what institutions are doing with their anti-Black racism initiatives. We know that it is the hot topic of the day. We know that there is productive value to individuals and institutions having a stake in the game in the moment. We're certainly at an institutional and structural level when these grand narratives of commitments to anti-Black racism are communicated. We need to be able to hold those individuals accountable. And I think that goes to what Kearie is talking about. What becomes those frameworks, those tools for us to hold institutions accountable? I mean, I'm coming out of an era where report cards, right, on an organization or a program or an institution was the ways in which we would try to evaluate the outcomes that they're assumed to have achieved. And I don't know if report cards are as effective anymore, but I joke about that a little bit, but I think that is the point, right? That we need to find what are those next tools. And lastly, what are those tools that allow community, right? Particularly at a grassroots level, to be able to hold institutions and systems.
Thank you so much. Maybe like 1 minute, just this last question. Did either of you hear about a public meeting where the MP from Richmond Hill asked the minister about what the ministry is doing about violence in schools? The minister mentioned focus on youth, Indigenous grad coach and grad coach for Black students. What are your thoughts on that? I don't know. Have you heard about that? You're not aware of the meeting?
I didn't hear about the meeting.
Okay, sorry, they did not hear about the meeting. So, well, that's it for questions. We wanted to make sure that we had time to kind of sum up what's happened today and have some action steps, call to action for folks that are here with us in person, those that are online as well, and any resources, tips you'd give folks who want to maybe change through policy and action in the area of anti-Black racism in Ontario schools. Would like to go first?
I can start. So I'll just to go back to that last question. So no, I did not hear about that meeting, but I would also question why we're talking, I guess, why the issue of violence in schools would come up at a discussion around Black children and their education. I think the leap and the jump and the connection there, we probably should examine and think about. So in terms of,
Just to be clear, the violence, they were talking about violence committed by or about violence as an experience.
I'm not sure.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for the person that posed the question, Peter wanted to get clarity on whether they're speaking about the violence that was committed.
Perpetrated by young Black folks, or violence as an experience that young.
That's a good question. So hopefully you can put that in the chat for us. Or let us know. And then
You're right.
That's a great question.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay.
You're right. I jumped. I made a jump. So in terms of what I would ask of people, I do think it is, we need, it's like a chorus, like a choir, right? Like we need, I always say we can't keep doing the same things we've been doing for so many generations. The story is actually not very different now than it was in the 60s or 70s, and there were advocates back then. And before Parents of Black Children, one of the reasons I wanted to start this group was because my son was 7 at the time, grade 2, and we were sitting in the office, and I brought my mother with me because I always bring someone, and my husband wasn't available, so I brought my mom with me to have this discussion with the principal. And I watched my mother have a discussion with this principal who was pathologizing my child, saying there's something wrong with him, but just all of the things that we know that happened to Black boys was happening to him. And I watched her advocate for my child. And I was so upset because I thought 30 years ago, she was doing the same thing, having the same conversation about me. The same conversation, right? There's something wrong with her and she needs to be in a special program, and this exact same conversation. And it was just so stark for me. And that story is not unique to me. That is the experience. This is generational now, where we have families who are going through the same experiences with their kids, and we need to stop it. So I would say that we need to think about, I'll go back to how I started, which is we're in a state of crisis. We have to operate like we are in a state of crisis, like this is COVID, right? And we need all hands to come together, all hands on deck, to push the people in power to make them accountable to us and our children. You know, when we have a minister of education who can say, well, what Black community, right? When you talk to him about what Black community, if we have a minister of education that can say that, we're not speaking with one voice. We are strong as a collective, and we need to operate like that. And that's how we're going to get the changes that we need. And I think the focus on policy is brilliant. That's what we need to do. Our communities have been so focused on looking down here, and sometimes we get money thrown at us as community organizations to do programs. So we're looking down, we're not looking up. We need to do more of the looking up. So I would say to people to talk to your MPs about these issues, right? You don't always have to wait for an organization like us. Go and do it yourself. Look and see what legislation the government is passing, and how can you as an individual provide that feedback. And then what are community organizations doing, and what are they advocating for, and how can you lend support? I think those are all really important.
Okay, thank you. Those are very practical.
Yeah, I think, you know, a few years ago, I was able to co-publish a piece called Towards the Practice of African-Centered Solidarity in Child and Youth Care. And in that paper, we challenge notions of allyship as a tool for transformation in favor of discourses of solidarity, etc. The reason why I'm saying that is because we require identifying those key things that require shifts, whether it be discourse, whether it be practice, whether it be terminology. Because when we deploy the term solidarity, what we're trying to advocate for is it requires a level of risk on an individual's part. And I'll extend it to say on a community's part. It requires levels of risk that allow you to be able to empathize with the communities that we're talking about, allow you to question your own performativity of allyship, etc. So for me, I think we have to get a little bit more intentional about those specific things that need to change in order to give us new lenses on the issue. Certainly, as Kearie has said, we do need to make sure that recognize that there is power in the collective, and as much as Kearie and I might differ on notions of Black and who it encompasses or who it doesn't. Again, there is a political purpose when we deploy the term Black, and that political purpose allows us to have a collective identity, and that we know historically there's always been power in it.
Thank you so much. We got clarity on the violence question. The person responded violence in school. Violence in school. So I don't know if that helps clarify the question.
I'll respond in the way I understand. And if I'm misunderstanding, please let me know. But I think that question makes the assumption that there's a connection between violence in schools and Black children. And I don't know that. I don't see that. And I don't really want to talk about that. I think, again, when we talk about we talked about Black graduation coaches, and yes, they're wonderful, but that pathologizing of our children, is there the problematizing of them? We need to get away from that that narrative. Yeah, we need to get, and we talked about policy, we talked about data. One of the things I'm interested in that I don't hear in the narrative of violence in schools more broadly is whether or not there is an increase of violence in schools. No one's ever said that. I don't know that there is. I know it's reported more. That doesn't mean there's an increase. I know there have been several instances this year. I don't know if those kids are Black. I don't think they are. So I'm not sure what it is the question is asking or what we're talking about here and why that connection's been made in this setting when we're talking about education and schooling of Black children. Yeah. Okay.
The only thing I'd add is
Yeah.
if that actually was a response by the
Minister?
MP,
Yeah.
then they've actively engaged in constructing that discourse of race, the experience of anti-Black racism for the young Black people within their jurisdiction. That the utterance of, hey, we got Black graduation coaches as a response to a question about violence in schools. That engagement creates the discourse.
Thank you so much. For parents or even youth or people in the community that are with us right now, are there resources that they should be aware of? I know you mentioned the tutoring. I know you mentioned the Human Rights Commission, I think you mentioned earlier. Yeah.
As a resource for documents, etc. I would say for young people, particularly those interested in this space of Afrocentric education, Wood Green Community Services runs an awesome Afrocentric rites of passage program. I highly recommend young Black folks who are interested in exploring their African identity to check out Wood Green Employment Services.
Thank you.
I would second that. Thank you. Amazing. There. I would add, you can always visit the Parents of Black Children website. We have a resources section, and there's resources on there for parents, and then we've got supports for young people as well in tutoring and mental health. But I also want to add that there are 17 student and family advocate organizations across this province. So they are organizations that hold a position of a student and family advocate, which is essentially a system navigator, an education navigator. And actually they cross systems so they can help with child welfare and the justice system as well. So if you go on to the website, studentfamilyadvocate.com, you can type in your address and you can find the organization that's closest to you. And so I would always recommend that we'll do that as well if you're looking for support.
Thank you. That ties in well. I was looking back at the camera. Julian, if you don't mind pulling back up the slide deck, there is a slide with additional resources. If you're located in Peel, Roots Community Services actually has a student family program as well. And they have some support programs for folks, just even around wellness. Sometimes talking about anti-Black racism is exhausting. And, we hear so much about the challenges and people are like, I know I'm Black. I know exactly what you're talking about. And we need supports to deal with the mental, emotional impacts as well. So there's programs available. If anybody found this discussion difficult or exhausting, there's programs available to talk about some of the challenges that you've experienced. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today, again, in person and online. And of course, our speakers for all your input, for your guidance, and thank you so much for the work that you do, the research that you're doing as well, Peter. I know that both Peter and Kearie will stick around for a few minutes for the folks here who have questions. And for the folks online, you're missing out on the patty and the juice. I'm so sorry. No cocoa bread though, yeah. But we appreciate you being here. Thank you for the questions that you posed. And at the Dais, we're all about not only talking about things, but actioning them. So I hope that the resources that our speakers shared today, you will take just one. I ask you to take one thing and put into action. Thank you all for joining us. And our next day's talks is going to be on anti-Semitism as well, and not next week, but the week after. So we'd love for you to connect with us and also register to attend that online or in person in Toronto. Okay, have a great night, everyone. Take care. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here.